Hello and welcome to episode 43 of the world's first Paul Weller fan podcast. I'm Dan Jennings, and 10 years ago I gave up my live streaming career as a radio presenter with one big regret: never getting to interview my hero, the legendary British musician Paul Weller. This podcast exists purely to solve that issue. Welcome to Desperately Seeking Paul. This week we hear from the fabulous musician-turned-award-winning author Daniel Rachel, the man behind the wonderful oral history books Don't Look Back in Anger and Walls Come Tumbling Down. We kick off with the UK in the 90s and a who's who of the decade, with Mr. Weller right in the middle. Then head back to the 80s for Red Wedge. We talk songwriting, a love of music with so many amazing stories and so much more. So let's get into it. Daniel, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Dan.
The most recent book of yours is bang into the time period when I first discovered the music of Paul Weller and really discovered myself in a way as well. So my radio career started, I properly got into music. So this kind of time period that you talk about so much, or these guests of yours, I guess, talk about so much, is exactly when I was into all that stuff. So it was a really lovely experience, but we'll talk about that in a sec. As this is the Paul Weller fan podcast, I'd love to know when you first discovered the music of Paul Weller.
Well, it's definitely the Jam. And, I don't know if there's a pivotal moment for first hearing the Jam. I think it was probably a disco of some sort or other, because I remember a kid called Dean Myers who used to have a really cool pair of black shoes and a long green parka. There was some kind of disco and he danced to, I think it was either Town Called Malice. I think it was Town Called Malice, so that suggests it was later. So that can't be right. But he danced and he was so cool. And I just wanted to be and dance like him. But I couldn't dance. And the only time I'd ever got on a dance floor would be if the dry ice filled it. And then you kind of had about 30 or 40 seconds where you knew you could do what you want and nobody could quite work it out. So I'd steal those moments. Plus the fact I was a rude boy and there was a clear delineation at our school between rudies and mods. And I secretly liked the Jam. I thought, yeah, but you can't admit that. So I'd use those 30, 40 seconds in the dry ice to try out my Dean Myers mod moves and then keep it very quiet that the Jam actually existed quite well alongside the Specials and Madness.
I love that. And you were clearly into music because so much of your writing is about music. Was that something from that time period as well? Were you discovering bands and loving music in that way too? Or was it just a bit of a hobby and, like the rest of us, you were just watching Top of the Pops? But it feels like a big passion of yours.
Life and music to me are totally entwined. I can't imagine anything other than that. Even when I started, I was watching recently some of those reruns of Top of the Pops, the story of 1975, the story of 1976. And there's so many tracks that I didn't even think I had in my mind conscience, being a 5 or 6 year old, and then suddenly it plays and it triggers something. And so from the earliest memories of probably being in back of cars and parents playing Radio 1. But the key moment for me was getting hold of a reel-to-reel, a Grundig reel-to-reel that my dad had taped songs off. And he had taped from Radio 1 in 1970, the story of the Beatles. And I remember getting this as about an 8-year-old, and it had hours and hours and hours of the Beatles being wacky and talking in their great accents and being funny, intercut with tons of their music. I was obsessed with that. I just endlessly play it, thinking these people are brilliant. They become like your friends, the Beatles, and you take your favourites and you feel like that you're in the middle of the four of them telling jokes to one another. So that was really, really, really key. And then a really big moment, this is going off Paul a little bit, was somebody came in with the lyrics of Too Much Too Young at school, and we sang them down the front, and I was 11 at that point. So even singing and records was so important, and music is important. I've never ever been without music in my life.
Let's talk about your latest book, Don't Look Back in Anger, which is the rise and fall of cool Britannia told by those who were there. And it's this lovely idea of, I think it's described as an oral narrative, which I haven't seen before, but I love the idea of hearing from the voices of the time. And I think there's something like 70-odd people talking. People like Noel Gallager, Damon from Blur, Foxy Fowler, Simon Fowler, I know is a really good mate of yours. I think wasn't he your flatmate at one point? Was that right? From Ocean Colour Scene.
Foxy Fowler. That's really funny. I've never called him Foxy in my life.
I thought that's what everyone called him. No,
I can always work out how people know Simon by what they call him. Simon's known about me since I was really small, and I knew about him, and then we became friends in October 1985 when I was 16. He lived 3 doors away from me, and then we were inseparable for the next 10 or 15 years. So, he's my best friend. I love him deeply. And oddly enough, but I already knew Steve before then, because Steve Craddock was my friend at junior school. And then Damon, talking about Ocean Colour Scene, was my friend at school. So there's all these kind of odd connections that lead to Paul. But Foxy is Simon's dad.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, because he always had his nose in other people's business. He was a copper. He knew everything. It was a kindly thing, and he embraced the name. I think Steve probably started calling Simon Foxy as a joke because he found out that his dad was Foxy, and then he kind of caught on with the Weller fellas, and then Simon wrote Foxy Face Folk. I mean, that song,
Foxy's Folk Face.
That song's like, that was another song. Simon, I recorded that in the year that I met Simon when I was 16. And I remember putting it on a tape and called it I, which is a rubbish title, but what a song.
Yeah.
I think everybody's after me. Oh, God, that used to destroy me when I first. We just play songs to each other all the time, and I'd always play that one. It's brilliant.
Talking of Ocean Colour Scene, so my first live experience of Weller would have been around 92. Paul Arts Centre in Dorset. We lived in Somerset. We had to travel there. And Ocean Colour Scene were supporting. It was first album, so it was the baggy period, if you like, before Riverboat Song, and we'll get into Riverboat Song in a sec as well. But that was part of my discovery of Weller, was Ocean Colour Scene from the very beginning too. And then obviously the band, Craddock's still playing with Weller, and Damon become part of Weller's band as well. So it's lovely how it's all linked. Back to the book, Simon's in there. You've also got Rick Blackstill, who's been on the podcast, and an old mate of mine who obviously ran Top of the Pops, which we'll talk about the Weller connection on that too. But and Alan McGee, who has been on the podcast very recently as well. But basically all these people from the 90s and a little bit of 2000s, the noughties, talking about essentially cool Britannia, this phrase that some people love, some people hate. But the fact that at this moment in time, we had the best bands, the best artists, the best fashion designers, and everything going on. You'd presumably interview people and then turn that into the book. It must have been amazing to dig into those memories, because by the sounds of things from your age, that must have been a key period for you as well.
Yeah, I mean, that period was really, really exciting. And to see Simon become the star that he was always from the day I met him was just brilliant. I mean, I just loved every second of their success. And so a lot of my experience of that decade comes from being in and around what they were up to, I guess, to a degree. I mean, I lived with Simon all through the 90s. For a few years, I lived with Steve and Simon, and then Steve lived above us in a flat in Moseley. In fact, that's the first time I met Paul, because Steve said, Paul's coming round for tea. Really? I mean, like, really?
Make it sound like a date.
I mean, we were all on the dole. Steve wasn't at that point because he started playing with Paul. So he was bringing back money, which he felt really guilty about. And it was, you very wonderfully would give Simon a wad of cash, which, when you can't afford, you're counting the pennies to the pint, to get a wad of cash was pretty amazing. But he said, Paul's coming around. So he did. He came around to the upstairs flat, which is like this really scuzzy, horrible place. Simon's window had a broken window in there for 2 years. He never fixed it. And his room was scattered with clothes, and he never unpacked his bag or packed it. It just was a mess. And his Gibson was lying around. He had this brilliant Gibson. And Simon doesn't care about possessions. In fact, only one thing he cared about was Neil Young Decade. He had the triple vinyl album, and he wouldn't put it with all the records in the living room. He kept it in his drawer underneath his socks. The only thing he cared about. It's quite strange. But yeah, Paul came round.
Didn't Steve put a record on it? Isn't it P.P. Arnold? Wasn't it a track from Kafunta?
Eleanor Rigby came on, and I was very quiet. I was always really shy. And I thought, I need to say something. And I went, it's really good, this, isn't it? Paul went, I don't think so.
Oh.
I was like, no. I was only kind of saying that. I realised at that point, stop trying to impress them, it's just say what you really think. It's not a great version. I mean, she wrote some brilliant songs. Anyway, I'm detracting from the 90s, sorry. But yeah, the 90s was really, really exciting. But it's always exciting because anything is when you're in your 20s. In your teens, in your 20s. And I was in a band anyway, Rachel's Basement, and exciting things were happening for us. But the idea of Cool Britannia, I don't think it had ever been properly defined. And it often gets used as a byword for Britpop. And they're very separate things in as much as Britpop is about music. Cool Britannia was a phrase used by American magazine journalists in New York who saw something that was happening in this country by the mid-90s that brought together all different facets of culture, be it literature, film, art, football, music, politics even. And in all of those areas, something quite incredible and dramatic was happening that hadn't happened in at least a couple of generations. And you could arguably compare it to the small idea of what swinging London was. And that's exactly what they did. And they said, this is Cool Britannia. But I don't think I probably had ever heard of that phrase. And I don't think any of my mates had in Birmingham. It just wasn't something that really crossed your mind until late 96, 97, when Vanity Fair and the magazine started using it. So yeah, I mean, to the book, I decided that the way to tell the story was to meet as many people as possible that were responsible for the creation of those areas and to tell their story and look at it from within. And yeah, many people disowned and hated the title Cool Britannia. Jarvis Cocker refused to be in the book at first because I said it was going to be Cool Britannia. And he said, it's such a horrible name. I'm not doing it unless you change the name. He didn't mean it in a kind of a starry way, but he just didn't want to be aligned with something that was so hideous in as much as a labelled media concept. It wasn't that. And that was the point of the book, really, to say there were all these people ploughing their own furrows independently of one another. And then those people started to mix. So like Jarvis would mix with Damien Hirst, and Damien Hirst would mix with Blur, and Blur would mix with football, and football would mix with politics. And the high point of that, I guess, or the thing that typifies it most in many ways, is Three Lions, which is a song written by Ian Brody, lyrics by two comedians, Frank Skinner and David Baddiel. It's a pop song, but it's about football, and it's done by comedians, and it's a kind of a gathering of storms. And all of this was, importantly, happening under a Conservative government. So therefore it was important to meet Virginia Bottomley, who was Heritage Minister at the time, and John Major, who was. And when I told John Major, he was shocked to remember that Cool Britannia happened under the Conservatives. Likewise, when I met Alistair Campbell and Tony Blair and told them to independently the same thing, they were shocked to realise they weren't responsible for it.
Yeah, because you're right. There is a link where the claim is it's a new Labour, and that's a big section of the book, obviously, as well, is Blair 95 leading the Labour Party 97 election. But actually, I suppose it's half of the book if you think about it, running to 2001, 2002. But it feels like that phrase has been hijacked by New Labour as them being responsible for everything around Cool Britannia and what that meant, being driven forward by them, whereas actually it wasn't that case at all. I mean, part of it, obviously, as it came through, and that energy and things was reflected in that, but it's a very different thing, isn't it?
I mean, Alistair Campbell says he doesn't think that Tony ever said the phrase Cool Britannia. I mean, just to quote from Virginia Bottomley, she issued 6 papers at the time directly about Cool Britannia and spoke about them in the House in that leader late 96 into 97. If people want to look at Noel going to number 10 to meet Tony Blair as the apogee of Cool Britannia. The photograph, yes, but the use of what was happening and how the media were talking about it was certainly the Conservatives. I mean, John Major, the famous speech at the Mayor's Banqueting Centre, where he quoted about Newsweek and London being the coolest city on the planet and such things. And equally, you know, that meeting at Number 10 was a meeting of Maureen Lipman and Nick Hornby and Lenny Henry, and it was a celebration of culture. And it just so happened that the photograph captured Tony and Noel together. And as Tony Blair says in the book, he wasn't even sure that Noel was coming. When they met, suddenly you just felt a parting and the cameramen jumped on it. It wasn't, you know, many things may have been manipulated or used, but actually I don't think that one particularly was. And then Noel brilliantly says, as he steps out of Downing Street to Alan McGee, they're going to kill us for this.
There's a quote in there from Noel as well, talking about, wasn't Weller furious about that picture just because of what he was wearing, I think. Was that right?
Yeah, well, Noel says something like, Paul thinks that a pair of shoes can change the world. He says it's just a pair of shoes to me.
That's right, yeah. and furious of the fact, I think Noel doesn't own a suit or something like that. I think it was lovely. So TFI Friday was a key part of this. Chris Evans was a key part of this too.
Massive.
Yeah, huge in terms of everybody had known it to that point. Top of the Pops was the show that he wanted to be on, whether it was The Jam, The Style Council, etc. But actually TFI comes along and Chris Evans and his production team are quoted quite a lot, Will McDonald and Susie Ablin and stuff, talking about the power of that show, both from and I think it really connects with Weller because he was on the show once and actually
What did he do?
He did, I think it was Mermaids. He was squeezed right into the end to the point that I don't even think he got to finish the whole song. He was the last one on. It must have been, Heavy Soul album, I'm guessing?
I was going to say, it's Heavy Soul, isn't it?
Yeah.
So what's that, 97?
Yeah. And but yeah, he was the last one on. And from what I can remember, didn't get to finish, like the screen time didn't get to finish that song. Like came off early.
The best song off Heavy Soul's Peacock Soup.
Oh yeah,
I asked Paul about that when I wrote Isle of Noises, and he was brilliant. He said something, you know, about the Narcissus in a puddle, and he said it was the combination of Greek mythology and classic ideas put onto a high street.
Wow.
That's brilliant. That's so Paul, isn't it?
That's nice, isn't it?
Taking a clever idea, he shows that. I mean, Paul's read, hasn't he? And he goes and looks at art, and he understands art, you know, or enjoys art, gets inspiration from it, maybe in the same way as somebody like Martin Scorsese does. But he can always filter his ideas into an accessible street way. And God, I love that song.
I'll talk about Isle of Noises in a sec, because this is an earlier book from you, which was Conversations with Great British Songwriters. And whilst we're on the topic, actually, let's cover this quickly. So you talk about songs with him, but many people, I mean, there's Ray Davies, Noel Gallager, Madness, John Lydon, Chris Difford and Glenn Tilbrook from Squeeze. But he talks about this idea of being in love with trying to condense a grand idea into a 3.5 minute pop song, which I thought was really interesting. And that still seems to me to be something he's really passionate about. Even the new stuff, Fat Pop, there was the new song that came out the other day. It was like 2.5 minutes, bang, done, in, out, done. Is that something you talked to him about at length to get to cut down for the book?
Well, absolutely, because I mean, I think he talked about the idea that Good Vibrations was within 3 minutes, and you know that whole the orchestration of Brian Beach Boy is just incredible to place within one song. And he said he used that as amongst many songs as a, you know, it's a piece of art. And his idea was has been to try and master that piece of art. I mean, I was listening to My Boy Lollipop the other day, and I realised it's under 2 minutes. I thought only Too Much Too Young was. I mean, that's something we used to laugh at, because Too Much Too Young is 2 minutes 3, and it's only 3 because he says Too Much Too Young at the beginning. But yeah, My Boy Lollipop, it's under 2 minutes, and that song changed the world. I mean, it introduced ska to British audiences and opened the floodgates of Jamaican music coming into that country. Can you imagine that something that lasts 2 minutes can change the world?
Much impact. That's incredible, isn't it? Yeah.
And Paul's part of that lineage for sure. And yeah, in Isle of Noises, it follows the lineage from the through each of the decades and key songwriters through the period, and Paul represents coming in the late 70s. He was a real master of that. I mean, the run of jam singles are quite extraordinary for their attempt to master the idea of the pop single. And you only have to think of Strange Town, A-Bomb in Wardour Street, Beat Surrender. And as you roll off the names, to my mind, it conjures as a listener the theme of the song, an encapsulated idea. That's quite a thing, because you can reel off other people's songs and you'd be going, well, what? I ain't got a clue what that song's about. I might have to go back and have a read. But Strange Town, you just know it, don't you? You know immediately.
The other quote that was in there that I think links back to what you were saying about now, he's so well read. He's clearly a smart guy. But there was this quote from him. He said, it was writing songs like Saturday's Kids and That's Entertainment. It was easy for me because that's just who I was.
Bingo, accents.
It's like, it was easy for me because that's just who I was. I was a very simple person. There isn't any great intellect behind it. And you're like, really? There must be. I mean, that just seems amazing to me that you can kind of, like an incredible poet to be able to write these things. But
he's got an instinctive intelligence. It's also a thing to underplay intelligence. Students, play down intelligence, play down good schooling. Don't. That's not a mark of things to hang your coat up on. It doesn't matter if he's well-read or not well-read. It's just the ability to be able to put your thoughts and ideas into a song, and he can do that. And of course, that became a greater thing, I think, in the early 80s when he linked up with Anna Joy David, who is at that point leading Youth CND. And Anna Joy, when I spoke to her, or have spoken to her, would tell me that she fed quite a lot of books to Paul, and going back to things like The Ragged Trousered Philanthropists, which is not an easy book to read, but it in terms of developing ideas about compassion for your fellow man and for society. And for, the great thing about that book is the idea of the money trick, and how if you work for the bosses, how the circle of money benefits the bosses, but it doesn't benefit you as the worker and for your extended family.
Interesting. So you mentioned about Paul, this link through the decades. Matthew Wright says that there's no Britpop without British identity. Paul Weller would be the link between the decades. And it's been really fascinating to read this through. You mentioned Isle of Noises, your other book, Walls Come Tumbling Down, which we'll touch on in a sec too, this journey from Paul from the early 80s right through from working Red Wedge and the Style Council, those incredible songs too, which we'll touch on in a sec, right through to that solo period from 91 right through, and where are we now? 30 years of solo period. But in Don't Look Back in Anger, where you're talking about majority of it being the 90s, it really was that link from then to now, and this whole Modfather thing came about as well. But he joined it all up, didn't he, from Oasis and Blur and Ocean Colour Scene? Yeah,
kind of. It's a strange one, really, because there's a definite divide in music in the 90s. There's two divides. There's the divide of are you into 60s music, and the journalist going, yeah, but which 60s music? And if it's kind of Who, Beatles, maybe Stones, and it's Small Faces, it's old and not cool. If it's Pink Floyd and a bit and some like Blur were doing, or then it is cool. And then alongside that was the influence of post-punk bands like The Jam and Clash, Stranglers, Adam and the Ants, Dirt Wears White Socks period. Bands like Elastica, Blur again, Supergrass heavily influenced by The Jam. You hear loads of their Supergrass riffs coming from all Mod Cons kind of period jam. That was all, again, as far as the press, the music journalists, that was all cool. And so a divide happened in those kind of ways. And that became what Britpop was in a way. But bands outside of Britpop, Oasis aren't Britpop, Paul Weller wasn't Britpop, and Ocean Colour Scene weren't Britpop in that kind of way of thinking. But as time goes on, it becomes an easy and loose definition. And so they get lumped into it, except Ocean Colour Scene don't, because they don't get lumped into anything because everybody hates them, of critical importance. They're ignored and dismissed, which is utter nonsense. But Paul, is strangely between those two cultures, and he has, this incredible run of records in that period. I remember seeing Paul, what you were talking about when OCS supported. I saw Paul first time in Portsmouth, and it felt like a 3/4 full dance hall, which is kind of odd, really, on that first album. with great tracks on it. Into Tomorrow, wow, Ball Rush, going into Magic Bus, lots of good songs, but still got that ethereal English sound, the flutes, not quite sure who the backing band should be, how it should work. And then it really changes, doesn't it, with Wildwood and obviously Stanley Road and those two records. Paul's performing. I saw him so many times in that period, tens of times perhaps, and his passion on stage was just incredible. The intensity of his performance, the intensity to the song, to the moment, to making the sound work was just brilliant. And then to have Steve jumping around on the side of him, doing his twirls and kicks and Townsend leaps and all that, when he was good at all that. Well, not good at what I'm talking about, good at all that. When he was
had the energy to do that, yeah.
And he was so exciting. We always said to Steve, when you go on stage, just go da 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 da, and I bet you all the crowd would go, "This is horrible." We're always trying to make him do it.
Brilliant.
And I remember Steve saying, he went, I said, "What's it?" Because you would, wouldn't you? What's it like? And he said, "I went round to Sunday lunch with Paul," and he said, "I'd been playing with him for a few months," but he said there was a moment. So I remember him saying, he was at Sunday lunch, and he suddenly said, like, "Would you pass the salt?" or something, or maybe he did, and Paul passed it, and he just suddenly went, "Oh God, it's Paul Weller," and he just had like a little moment. But no, Steve was very cool in that period, handled it very cool.
I remember reading that Steve Craddock used to turn up at the Jam studio, I think, and Kenny Wheeler like chucking him out all the time.
Well, the thing is that we were all in bands in the 80s, mid-80s. Damon was in a band called Transaction. I was in a band with Simon called Great Betrayal. And Steve was in a band called Deadline. And then they became the Boys. And the Boys were a complete copy of the Jam, albeit that they wore white. Sometimes they wore suits, and then they all went into white. Steve played a Rickenbacker bass, and Steve sang like Paul. And the songs, and Steve would be doing jumps, with it, to the side. And it was a joke. I mean, Damon didn't want Steve in the band at the beginning because he thought he was a jam joke, and that was Steve. But the brilliant thing is, he had that thing to go down to London, stand outside Solid Bomb, give him a demo tape, and I think he went back down, and Paul said to him the next time, "Well, you just sound like us," in a way to say, stop mucking about. If you're going to do this, find your own way. And to all Steve's credit, he did. The important change between what you referred to earlier as the first Ocean Colour Scene album, that's Ocean Colour Scene, not the Sound-Out album, but that album has been pushed by Simon, because Simon's influences were Neil Young and the Buzzcocks and the Stones, and was pushing the influence, because Simon was quite an imposing figure in that kind of way. You went where he went. But Steve came into his own in that 92, 93 period at Bob Lamb's studio in Birmingham, where they were there every day doing amazing things, but nobody wanted to know. And it almost felt like a snap, something changed, that Steve rediscovered the sensibility of mod. And with that, he'd neglected his electric guitar, really. They were doing all these tracks like The Whitest Wife in the World and God's World, and they're doing Mama Cass covers. Oh, and also the odd things like La 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 Lies and The Who. They were doing songs, but it was guitar light. And it was quite strange to think of them without heavy guitar. And then Steve suddenly re-embraced the guitar, and they started doing things like Get Blown Away, and it was like, wow, something's kicking off here. There's a really important club in Birmingham called Sweat. A guy called Des ran it in the back of the Institute, and it was every couple of weeks, I think, playing acid jazz, newer stuff like Corduroy, but really old stuff going back to James Brown and Northern Soul tracks. And it was a so cool club. And that became hugely influential, and Ocean Colour Scene played it in about 94, 95, before they were well known. And Paul came down to that. Again, it was one of those moments, like the anointed air of all this has come to, and everybody's flocking around him. I can't remember if he played or not, actually. I don't think he did.
How amazing, God, honestly. I mean, the book's brilliant, I have to say, from the journey all the way through, right to understanding. I mean, you were kind of kicking off Mandela being released, Nirvana, Big Breakfast, I mentioned Evans earlier, Blair, Euro 96, all these memories kind of came flooding back when I was reading. It was lovely. And there's a lot of bits about Weller in there, which is lovely. And the idea that Liam Gallagher's talking about Noel Gallager being the Weller fella was something I really liked as well.
That became our catchphrase when we heard like that. Walla fella.
Yeah, I thought it was really cool. But there's so much in there, so much packed in there. It's brilliant, honestly, man. I have to say, it's a real joy to read. But the other thing I wanted to touch on was Walls Come Tumbling Down, which was the book, and I guess in a way, Don't Look Back in Anger is a sequel to that book, yeah? So Walls Come Tumbling Down, not only is the title taken from a Style Council song, which we'll talk about in a sec too, but this is the music and politics of Rock Against Racism, Two-Tone and Red Wedge. And Paul was such a massive part of Red Wedge. I mean, essentially it was him, Billy Bragg, Anna Joy David, the three of them driving that forward. And it would be great to hear about, from the research that you did, how much of that you were talking to people about Paul's influence on that, particularly on that Red Wedge. And talking to some people on the podcast, there's a view where now people think that wasn't, it wasn't a success in the sense that Labour at the time didn't get in. I think when reading the follow-up book from you can kind of see, well, that laid the groundwork for what came next with Blair. Without Red Wedge, you wouldn't have got to that point, I don't think, personally. But it'd be lovely to hear what your thoughts were.
Yeah, I mean, Red Wedge became very much a simple soundbite and a dismissive one at that. And I was always aware of that, having been at the Red Wedge gig in Birmingham in January 1986, and all the way through until I decided to write the book. I'd never heard a fair or even I hadn't read an examination of Red Wedge to understand what it was, because people said that Margaret Thatcher won the 1987 election against Red Wedge, that Billy Bragg and Paul Weller lost the election. I mean, it's just absurd. That wasn't the point. And very, very simply, the point of Red Wedge was just to encourage voter registration. Sorry, that was the aim. Simple as that. And then within that, to kind of put a different version of life to people, which was exemplified by Red Wedge Day events, which were extraordinary, which Paul was a major part of, where Anna Joy David would spend months before any Red Wedge gig going to youth centres and small towns and finding disenfranchised youth, people outside that weren't fortunate enough to go to sixth form college or were struggling in work and felt their voices weren't being heard. She found these people and brought them to day events where they would meet a local politician, often a leading national politician, and a selection of pop stars of the day, be it some were Paul, sometimes it would be Paul and Billy and the Communards or people from Madness or Rhoda Dakar, and there would be a conversation and a debate. That in itself is extraordinary. Paul was a number one artist. Can you imagine Adele going with Skepta and Alex Turner, and you go down at 3:00 into the village hall and you have a debate and you talk about the political situation and how things could change if you registered to vote and thought about different ideas. That's madness, and they did it. And that's incredible. Just that in itself. Then you go to a gig on the nighttime, forget the politics, just enjoy some music.
Well, yeah, and the lineups. I mean, you mentioned some of them, but Madness, the Heaven 17, Bananarama.
You have to be careful of this, because these kind of lists run away with themselves when they're not always true. But Bananarama signed up for it, but never did a gig. The other did one in the later years. Elvis Costello would never do Red Wedge, but he came in at Newcastle on the day of the Tube, when they performed on the Tube, and saved an event at Newcastle Uni there was going to be some mass riot because somebody had leaked that Paul was playing and he wasn't playing, but it made it into the NME. And so all these people came down to the event. And then when they discovered it wasn't a Style Council gig, all kinds of things went on. And they managed to get Elvis Costello, who was coincidentally performing on the Tube that day. And he offered to come in and step in and did a 40-minute set, which is quite incredible. I mean, also Paul, I was interested in finding out how much Paul really did dismiss the idea of Red Wedge, or what I suspected and was the case was that if you're involved with something for 2 to 3, 4 years, there's a depth there that is worth unpicking and revealing. And that story of Paul, goes back to hearing Anna Joy David on the LBC radio talking to 250,000 people in Hyde Park and being impressed by her. And then them two forming an alliance, which led through CND, Green and Common issues, ran parallel to Billy Bragg doing Jobs for Youth tour, led to the formation of Red Wedge tours. And then after the election, Paul stays on and meetings are still held at Solid Bond. And he's still a director, I think, of Red Wedge at that point. And Red Wedge goes on until early 90s. And what I felt was hugely important was to speak to Neil Kinnock, which I did, and to discover what he felt was effective. Now, here, what's important to remember is that never in the history of rock and roll have musicians tried to change society from the inside, i.e., rather than being like Rock Against Racism or punk or whoever, anarchists from the late 50s, early 60s, and be anti-establishment and anti-society. Red Wedge took the opportunity that there was an open door into Parliament and something could change on the statute book. That's the way to change society, to get the rules changed. And so they took advantage of that, and Neil Kinnock embraced them. Then the question is, well, what did he embrace, and did anything change? And the brilliant thing here is that Pete Jenner, who was Billy Bragg's manager, Anna Joy, who I've mentioned, and Neil Spencer, who had been the editor of NME, they drew up policies and ideas of what Red Wedge stood for. They produced a kind of a catalogue, and it's very, very well written. It's not written in pop talk. It's written in housing needs, in job needs, in women's needs, in gay rights needs. And it's a hardcore read that is decisive and to the point. And Neil Kinnock said that when the wholesale undressing of Labour took place in the late 80s, early 90s, leading up to what they hoped would be a 92 election victory, the ideas that were fed into Red Wedge were fed in to Labour Party policy. And within the manifesto, he said that was a vindication of Red Wedge. Now, obviously, they don't win. And you can hear people think, maybe listeners going, well, there you go, nothing happened. But the important thing is then Kinnock explained that when Blair came in 97, there was no re-examination or analysis of the Labour Party's manifesto or mandate for government. So they took what existed already. Therefore, Neil's ideas and the Red Wedge ideas. So just immediately comes to mind the green ideas that Red Wedge promoted. Free museums was a Red Wedge idea. There were areas like this. And so it did filter its way. If you change a law, you change society. Therefore, you're changing the world. Therefore, music is changing the world. You know, I have this argument with Billy Bragg all the time. Billy says music can't change the world. I completely and utterly disagree. It does. It changes how people think. It changes their actions. And that comes from the song that you've heard. And whether that was Walls Come Tumbling Down, that didactically told you how to think in a more compassionate way, or it was Between the Wars. You know, the didactic songs get inside your mind and make you act in a different way. That's music changing the world.
Yeah, well, it's remarkable, I think, like you say, and Paul's influence and the connection, like I say, between the two books of that story from Red Wedge to then be, actually, you're right, the end result is New Labour and the good that came of that. And I think the downside of the Iraq War and that decision from Blair has clouded everything, and that legacy of the good stuff that came from New Labour.
What Prime Minister hasn't been to war? Everybody, yeah. That's just men, isn't it?
Really? Well, Thatcher did as well, though, to be fair.
Well, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. But it's generally men that go to war, isn't it? You know, we go to war in the playground when we're 6. You know, all the girls don't get round and have a big fight to decide who's top dog, do they? You know, it's men that do it, it's boys that do it. It's adolescents that do it. Doing it all through the 80s and having fights at gigs, and it's just men being ridiculous, and it carries on, and it's just a form of fighting. That's all that kind of politics ultimately is, isn't it? It's showboating and fighting. Paul saw that. That's the great thing, and that's where I think he becomes most dismissive about Red Wedge, is because he saw the egos of MPs and felt that they were greater than the egos of pop stars. That's going some, isn't it?
Yeah, God. Well, yeah, and also I think, like you say, like some of the politicians may be looking at it for the wrong reasons and not doing it because they want to change things and influence things, but doing it, you know, attaching themselves to Weller because he's a pop star and being in the photo shoots because that looks cool and things like that.
But it's that. But the point, politics at the heart is about power. If you haven't got power, then what's the point of being a politician? Or how do you get power? You have to use the situation. And then when you're in power, you have to keep it, because somebody's after your area of power. It's all about power games. Obviously it is. But within those power games, the land has to be run. The people have to be governed. Laws have to be made. That's a toxic mix immediately.
Obviously, the title of the book's taken from Walls Come Tumbling Down, taken from the Style Council. But were you a big Style Council fan, or was it more? No, not at all.
I don't really like the Style Council. No, I mean, there were some pop songs that I liked by the Style Council, but they're far and few between. But when they were good, they were brilliant. Shouts to the Top, Internationalists, Walls Come Tumbling Down, Solid Bond in Your Heart. There are some really great songs, but my greater problem is not with Paul's songwriting, or as you say, his most didactic period of lyric writing in his life. It's the production. And I'm not a fan of 80s production. And that's what mars those records for me, really. And I didn't like the look of the band, really. I didn't like some of the videos, everything about it. I wanted aggression. To me, what Billy Bragg was doing with the one-man Clash was powerful and said it. To Have and to Have Not by Billy Bragg and Walls Come Tumbling Down are from the same bag of aggression. But more Billy records stay in that vein than what Star Council records do. So I always struggled with the Star Council. Plus the fact people around our way used to wear jumpers round over their shoulders and tie it in the middle and, wear white trousers and then, no socks, and they just look rubbish. I was a rude boy. A rude boy, that doesn't marry me.
That doesn't work.
And it kind of looked a bit like the 80s. And then Paul had a Phil Oakey haircut, didn't he? And I wasn't into it. And it's going to annoy people, isn't it? But the Jam were better. Simply, they're just better. Ultimately, if your house is burning down or you're going to a desert island, you grab your Jam records, wouldn't you?
You mentioned the solo years in terms of those early records, Sandy Road, Wildwood and that. How have you felt about the career since? So have you because this is a long period of time, there's a lot of albums in that to dissect, which we won't have time to, but are there highlights from that after post-90s, post maybe the next book that stand out for you in terms of Paul's work?
I'm just going to get hate mail now because I don't know. I mean, the thing is, I admire Paul is making records and pushing himself as a songwriter in ways he hasn't worked before. And that's all an artist can do. But Paul's voice has changed. I think he uses quite a lot of tropes now that voice-wise across a lot of his records, and they're more mature and older, and they're probably taking in influences that I don't know or understand. And they work for him, and they work for a large portion of his fans, and particularly they critically work. I mean, he's had this extraordinary run of number one albums, but Fast Cars and From the Floorboards Up, I tend to gravitate to tracks like that. And again, it sounds like the Jam in a way, doesn't it? It's not. I'm not saying that I want the Jam because that's just absurd and it's ridiculous. But I haven't followed. No, I mean, I'm not of the line that if you're into somebody when they're young, follow them and like it. And just because they're exploring a different musical avenue or cul-de-sac, But that's. I come and go more now with Paul records and live. Likewise, sometimes. I mean, I went to a gig not how long ago would it have been? 4 or 5 years ago, and Paul played, and he did Shout to the Top, and I thought, heard it from the opening bars. I thought when the audience are going to go ballistic, and they didn't, and I thought that was strange. Why would you not go mad to Shout to the Top? And then he came out once and did an acoustic gig supporting Ocean Colours only a few years ago. Oh, it's brilliant because he was wearing monkey boots, Levi jeans turned up, and a blue Harrington. And I think I was with Simon. I said, look at Paul, he looks like a Jam fan. And he came out and he did about 4 or 5 acoustic songs, and they just kind of received like a support act would be received. It's a strange, I can't quite understand. But then the thing that I don't want to balance an admiration against kind of being slightly dismissive of some of the records, just from a personal point of view, being dismissive, is that when I saw him do Sonic Kicks at the Roundhouse, he came out and played the whole of Sonic Kicks.
I was there. Yeah, I was there first night. I was there. Yeah, it was incredible.
Yeah, I think it had only come out that day, so nobody knew it. Then he went out. Then he went off for an interval. Then he came back out, and I thought, well, some people have done this in the past. Lou Reed did it with New York and came out and then did Velvet songs in the second half. So I'm thinking, well, Paul's going to come out and do Eton Rifles. But of course he didn't. He did all kind of like stranger songs like Porcelain Gods and lesser known album tracks for the whole of the second half, as I remember. But what I thought was amazing was it was the point at when lots of bands were reforming to do their album, like Echo and the Bunnymen or Ocean Colour Scene. We'll go and play our album. And Paul thought, well, I'm going to do my album, my new one. Wow, that's a lot of nerve and says a lot about him. So I have immense respect for what he does, but he doesn't carry me with every record, no.
That's the great thing about this podcast as well, is that there are so many people listening who have said, actually, you know what, the thing for them was the jam, and to them, music in a way stopped existing post 1982. And that's cool, that's fine as well. And there'll be hopefully enough on this podcast to entertain people and interest people on that as well. There are some people like myself who discovered him solo years and actually have dug into the back catalogue and love an awful lot of it. But then other people have just liked the solo stuff and none of the style cuts and none of the jam. And that's cool as well. You know, you don't have to be there from day one to 20, you know, from 1977 to 2021 and love everything all the way through.
What I do love all the way through is his clothes. He's such a great dresser, isn't he? I wish I had money and I could go and buy some clothes. It'd be really nice. And yeah, I'd be definitely checking out what he was wearing.
I bet when he came to your crappy flat, he looked the part, right?
I think he would probably have Levi's on that were ripped a bit at the bottom, but above the desert boots. And he didn't wear Clark's desert boots. He wore, what's it called? I've gone from my mind. But yeah, he had a different, slightly, the desert boot.
More expensive desert boot, I'm imagining.
No, they're not.
Oh, right.
They were kind of the same price or a little bit cheaper than Clark's. I mean, Clark's have gone ridiculous, haven't they? About 80 or 90 quid now. It's madness. It's a long journey from Ken Barlow wearing them, isn't it?
Walls Come Tumbling Down. Did you ever get Paul's opinion on it? Did you ever find out what he thought about the writing of Red Wedge?
Yes. Oh, God, yeah. I mean, before I started the book, I asked Paul if I could use the title, which just out of courtesy. And he brilliantly said yes. And he said, just use anything I've ever said before. And he waived the charge for the use of the lyrics in the book. And he made sure that the publishers didn't charge me either. That was brilliant, because I know a song is owned part by the songwriter, part by the publishers. The publishers don't care what the songwriter thinks, really. Yeah, they want to make their money. And Paul, that was an amazing thing to do. And I was really worried. And I said this recently in that new Star Cancer book that has just been published.
So deep, yeah.
Yeah, and Paul, I was at an Ocean Colour Sing gig on the side of the stage, and Paul was there. And I said to him, I wrote Walls Come Tumbling Down, and Daniel, did I do all right by you? And he just kind of, nodded. And I thought, And I thought, oh dear. And we were watching the gig, and he was slugging his girlfriend behind the flat. So I thought that'd be funny if they'd blow and everybody in the crowd. But then he came over to me later and squeezed my shoulder, and she said, "You did all right, Bunny." And I was I melted, to be honest. It's like, because it was so important. To be vindicated by him for what I've done, because the importance of that book, really, as like Billy said to me when I said I asked Billy's permission again. I said I'd like to do the story of Red Wedge. Would you be okay with that? And he said, yeah, but you have to tell the story of Rock Against Racism, because otherwise it won't make sense. And in fact, I think probably a solid third, if not more, is the story of Rock Against Racism. That's absolutely incredible. And talking to over 100 people, and in particularly people like Linton Kwesi Johnson and members of Steel Pulse and Aswad and Misty and Roots, Dennis Bovell. And I really wanted to get the black experience of Britain in the 70s, the black experience of early 80s Britain from their point of view. And that was very, very different. Their experience of what it's like to be at school and be on the end of white kids going, you all white, mate, really, and then beaten up. And when you don't come home from school on time, the first place your mates go or your parents go is the cop shop, because they just assume you've been arrested. Paul played under a Rock Against Racism banner right at the end. I feel very passionate about what that story tells, because it's the story of British Black Britain, and it's the story of British whites trying to make a better human condition for all to exist in. And of course, where that really explodes is in Jerry Dammers. And first with the whole concept of two-tone and the multicultural band, the Specials. And then, that idea that Nelson Mandela stands on stage in 1990, a free man after 27 years of incarceration, and the band and everybody has just come on stage and sang the song Free Nelson Mandela, written by Jerry Dammers. And in that leap, 16 years, if you go back to when Clapton made those outrageous comments at the Birmingham Odeon, telling the black people in the audience to go back to their own country, the leap of a youth generation being told by 1990, it's cool to be anti-racist. That's the coolest thing you could possibly ever be. That was incredible. And to tell that story in Walls Come Tumbling Down, I was hugely proud. And Paul's song is at the heart of that.
Yeah, no, it's remarkable, I have to say. This has been so lovely, Daniel. A couple of things to touch on before we go. One is what's coming next, because I think what's coming next is Paul Weller will love what's coming next, I reckon. The idea of the next book is that what would have happened if the Beatles hadn't split up. Is that right?
Like Some Forgotten Dream. It's a John Lennon lyric from a Beatles song. I'll let your listeners work that one out, which one it is. Yeah. And it's Simon and I, when we were in our 20s, or maybe before, always used to play this fantasy game with each other. And Simon used to call it early 1970. And it was, what would the Beatles album have been in 1970? And we'd always be going, have you heard this track? Have you heard that? Did you know Paul had written this in 1968? Did you know Give Me Some Truth, John and Paul played together in 1969 at Twickenham? And then did you know George wrote this for Ringo? And there's this an amazing version. And so we used to play this game. And then I suddenly thought, that could be a book. I wonder. It was the purpose of the book is to look at all the missed opportunities and chances that could have changed the fate of the Beatles splitting. There are a lot of them, and a lot of just guys being guys in their 20s, not knowing how to speak.
Yeah, communication, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, communication. And then there's the incredible meeting on 9th September 1969 at Apple, where John says to George and Paul, okay, next album, 4 songs each. I have 4, Paul, you have 4, George has 4, Ringo can have 2 if he wants them. What do you think? And that's the pivot point where the book says, okay, imagine now that became a reality. And so I slightly stretched the idea, and I imagine them, as they always were groundbreaking, doing a double album called 4 Sides of the Beatles. And they, because of the circumstance of what the disagreements are, and George really frustrated that he's not getting room and not being treated how he wants to be treated, they each get a side of an album. The book examines these songs. They're the 6 songs that each of them would have done had they had a side each, 4 sides of the Beatles, as the record that followed Abbey Road. Of course, Let It Be follows Abbey Road, but not sequentially in the recording process. Yeah. So that's another big question. And these are things I have to answer. What happens to Let It Be if there's another Beatles album? And there's a strict criteria. So you can't have Maybe I'm Amazed because it's written while he's still a Beatle. But you can't have Live and Let Die because it's outside the time frame. You can't have Mind Games because it started being written in 69. And there's all these things like this. And Ringo gets some great songs.
This sounds incredible. When is this out, Daniel?
End of August. Comes out just after Oasis at Nebworth, which I've had the absolute privilege of writing next to Jill Fermanovsky's photographs of the great weekend in 96.
Wow, this is incredible. I have to say, you're a very productive chap. This is great. Hey, look, I've got 2 final questions for you, right? You're allowed 1 Paul Weller song for the rest of your life. Which one is it? It can be the Jam, the Style Council, or solo.
Man in the Corner Shop.
Oh, why that one?
I just love the idea of the chain of events of the one person's looking up to the other person, is looking up to the other person, is looking up to the other person. So lyrically, it's brilliant, and melodically, it's beautiful. And that's enough, isn't it?
That will do. Yeah. That's all we need. Love it. Final question. Purpose of this podcast, it's called Desperately Seeking Paul. So the purpose of this podcast, it's to talk to lovely people like yourself, obviously. But really, it's all about meeting Paul. It's being able to get the interview with Paul that I never managed to get in my radio career. I gave up life as a presenter 10 years ago with that one big regret. If I do get the interview, what should I talk to him about?
Wow. It would be something to do with songwriting. Something about the sound of a record, something in that vein. That's a really hard question, isn't it?
It's not easy. I appreciate it.
Yeah, because what you're asking me to do is what I asked myself to do regarding noises, isn't it? I used to have a dream as a kid, like we all used to do when I was going through smash hits of, just imagine if you could sit down with your favourite pop star and talk about their songs for all afternoon. That was my little fantasy, if it could have been Adam Ant, or it could have been Terry Hall or whoever, But and I ended up doing that. I sat with Paul for a good number of hours. He quizzed me about the Kinks. So ask him that. He said to me, what do you think of the Kingston in the 70s records? And I was thinking, whoa. And I love things like sitting in my hotel and sitting in the midday sun. And then I suddenly thought, hey, he nicked that in Boy About Town. And I asked him about that. And so we kind of had it. So ask him about what are the great kink songs from the 70s after Supersonic Rocket Ship.
Great stuff. I have to say that's brilliant. Just to touch on Island Noises, was he open to talking about songwriting? Because everything I've read about recently, there's a bit where he's kind of going, I just don't know how I come up with it. It comes to me and I'm not sure. And sometimes he seems a bit closed on that topic and that he doesn't want to overanalyze lyrics and what they're about because they mean different things to different people. And often he's not quite sure. But it seems like he was very open to talking about that kind of stuff with you.
I originally asked if I could have an hour and a half with Paul. And Claire said, you've got to be kidding. He's never talked for more than 10 minutes on songwriting.
Oh, no.
I said, he's got to, because otherwise his chapter's going to look rubbish. But what was incredible was, of course, I was intimidated and a bit scared. But he was so considerate. And he, instead of shutting down my questions, he opened them up and took time to consider what I was asking. And I think I had a pretty good run. He didn't get bored until quite near the end, probably when I started asking him what he thought about Santa Gold doing Pretty Green. Why? You got enough, mate. See ya.
Yeah, let's hope I can have a similar experience. Daniel, this has been so lovely. I thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it.
Thanks very much for having me. It's been good fun.
My thanks once again to the brilliant Daniel Rachel. Do make sure you check out the books Don't Look Back in Anger, Walls Come Tumbling Down, and Isle of Noises. You can find the links in the show notes for this podcast. Next up, the magnificent Neil Sheasby from Stone Foundation. We dig into his story of a love of the jam at school to the Style Council, Weller solo, and plenty of collaborations with the great man since. Don't forget to please click share on this episode and post it on social media. It's a busy old place, so the more you can help us to shout about this podcast, the more it helps us to find new listeners to the show. You can get in touch on Twitter @WellerFanPod or on Instagram and Facebook. It's Paul Weller Fan Podcast. I'll see you next time.